Alrighty. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first session of what we're calling the Playful Horizons Featured Speaker Series. This is a program we're going to be running throughout the semester where we'll be interviewing a handful of emerging rock stars about their amazing work in critical game studies and game design. We'll be chatting with scholars, makers, and industry folks from across Canada and the United States, and we hope that hearing about the cool shit these folks are doing will help you inspire your own making and thinking about video games. I'm PB, I'm an assistant professor. I teach here in Media and Technology Studies.
I'm Kenzie Gordon, I use she, her pronouns, and I am a PhD student and an instructor in the online section of Understanding Video Games.
So I'm going to pass things over to Kenzie, who will be introducing our first speaker, the unrivaled Christine H. Tran, and then we're going to take turns asking Christine some questions about their ongoing work. And if you have questions for Christine, make sure you join us for a live Q&A session we'll be hosting with her in Discord on Monday, October 21st at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. Take it away, Kenzie.
Pause, because can you hear my stupid dog barking?
Yes.
I'm gonna go put her bark collar on.
Sounds
I'm
great.
so sorry.
No, it's okay. That's why
No worries at all. It's relevant. Thank you for
Yes.
giving me a good segue for what I wanted to talk about. Barking dogs and pet interruptions.
Yes.
That's the foundation of this work.
Yes, a window into the home.
Okay. Sorry.
No,
No
not
worries
at
at
all.
all.
Incredibly relevant. Christine and I were just talking to Christine's
I
work
love-
about how streaming and live video brings us into the home in ways we don't expect.
Pet interruptions. I love pet interruptions. They're like the bread and butter.
You don't even get to see the pet though, so not so great.
Can I quickly ask what breed your dog is?
The annoying one is a sheepdog poodle cross, and my
Aw.
good dog is just a regular standard poodle.
Kenzie,
nice.
are we allowed to ask for a photo of the annoying one that we can splash on the screen for
Yeah.
interested viewers?
Yeah. You can take a shame photo.
Perfect. Here's a shame
Mugshot.
photo. Everybody shame Kenzie's dog.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, PB. So our speaker today is Christine H. Tran, who uses they, she pronouns. Christine is a digital clown and LTA assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where they are among the inaugural faculty hired to develop and teach the game studies program offered by both the Department of English and Drama and the ICIT. With a current focus on the creator economy, Christine's research examines how video platforms orient user experiences of leisure, labor, and love in the home. Funded by the Shirk Doctoral Fellowship, their PhD dissertation in the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information uses digital ethnography to document the cultural influence of Twitch TV, Amazon's world-leading game streaming platform, on the future of work from home for marginalized groups in the cultural industries. They have published research in peer-reviewed journals such as Television and New Media, Communication, Culture and Critique, New Media and Society, JCMS, Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Information Communication and Society, Global Media and China, and the Canadian Journal of Communication. You can read or watch her commentary and stories from The Guardian, Wired, BBC Future, CBC, Business Insider, Slate, The Globe and Mail, and other outlets. So we are so excited to have you with us today, Christine. So to kind of get things started, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your academic background, and how you got into studying games in the first place?
All right, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for that question. I could when people ask me to position myself between disciplines, I like to start out that I've been in a lifelong joint custody agreement between information studies and English literary studies. Throughout I started in another world. I would have done a PhD in early modern European women's literary networks. And I know that's a big temporal pivot. But I think the through line of this work is I've always been interested in perhaps, that juvenile question of why does he or they get to play where I or they have to work? And this question of who works so others can have fun jobs has been a prevailing one between a lot of the research that I've been doing. So broadly now, emerging from my dissertation work, I did a critical ethnography and interviews of streamers from marginalized backgrounds at the intersection of race and gender to basically have an excuse to examine how they relate to their homes and their production and creation of careers as professional live streamers. Broadly, I like to think about how games and games culture make home a more precarious space for a specific type of players. I think important to this journey and where I'm coming from is that I did conceived of this project and did the field work for it during the pandemic, when many of us were being tasked by headlines and, it's going to be okay campaigns in the pandemic to say we are all streamers now, and to quote one Wired article famously declared that Zoom was our stage. And my work looks at how through the story of live streaming, however we want to define it, we get to see this story that map together the story of this ongoing question across feminist game studies and feminist leisure studies about the work it takes so that others can have play spaces. Broadly, I'm interested in how the home draws the boundaries between who gets to exist both within and outside the hegemony of play, and how everyday uses of technologies, from webcams to gamer chairs, green screens, even mirrors and curtains, right down to noise canceling microphones, create these playful time spaces that can't escape being structured by gender and race. So, because the home historically has been positioned as a place of solace for women, if they were white, for Black women and other women of color, it has always often also been a site of precarity where their labor gets extracted, where they're often legislated and coerced to care for others. And we see, in my research, I see how those dynamics of, yes, having the comfort and proximity to home and knowing where the emergency exits are, where the bathrooms are in your space, also has to be tempered by this consideration of bringing these long-standing concerns about surveillance and harassment into further intimate spaces.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Christine. And I think, our students can certainly relate to many of them having to, pivot to e-learning platforms during the pandemic. Many of them, of course, relying on platforms like Discord for so much of their gaming and making, thinking about the ways that we're all caught up in these in the process of streaming and thinking about cameras and angles and the layouts of our rooms and our giant plushies in our backgrounds. It's fascinating.
Moving through your research, you didn't think you'd know this much about your advisor or your colleague's bedroom or their pets or their partners.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very strange day for me when I saw all the games that my dissertation supervisor was playing in the sidebar on Discord, and I was like, oh, interesting. Wasn't expecting that. And Christine, your research spans so many different topics, from internet studies to games to digital labor. Can you tell us just a little bit about what your research is focusing on right now and what drew you to that topic?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I love to build on this notion that other people have talked about, like Patrick Lemire and Stephanie Bullock, right? And you can edit that if I'm saying their names wrong, about metagaming. Games being these mediums that are excuses to create other games, and essentially being inherently promiscuous mediums that, from platforms to paper, they invite different relationships to media assemblage and participation. And I love that I'm currently working on projects that further think about the role about games and the broader creator economy, not just in the live service you've come to expect from live streaming and esports, but also that relationship between games as an accessory to influencer careers, and how the parameters and genres we saw set up about audience interaction and audience building, we saw set up in Twitch streaming get taken up on other platforms. Like, I've been interested, for example, in the NPC streamer trend on TikTok, as many other lab applications besides Twitch take up or have already long taken up the idea of selling live entertainment. Many of the tropes game scholars and game designers are familiar with, in terms of not only obfuscating themselves and augmenting themselves in playful ways, but also inviting gamified interaction, and are taking up in interesting spaces. I've also been interested, as many of us have perhaps been encouraged to because of the times, to think about what a feminist game studies framework specifically can do to unpack issues in AI and AI ethics. For many of us, games represent our very first intimacies with what we would call AI tools, like algorithmic adversaries, machine learning, and like live streaming, they're kind of a medium that is both AI and live streaming are both kind of mediums that whose technologies and popular interest have been bolstered through games. So at this intersection, my next stage of my research, I'm looking to potentially soon interview creators who are interfacing with AI tools in different ways games as playable media in their everyday life, and seeing how these questions of like automation and time-saving devices play out.
Yeah, thank you. That's so interesting. And I think like anytime you talk to a game developer, they have a strong take on AI, but it's either like absolute terror or like this is going to transform the way that it works. So really interesting to kind of dig into that.
Yeah, there's so many things.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking, I'm also teaching a critical game studies course right now. I got to assemble a senior seminar where we're thinking about like those legacies of not just those technical memories, but emotional memories you'd have to that player too. You know, shout out Shira Chest about the non-human artificial adversary or co-player you'd have if you didn't have siblings or friends to play with alone. Sorry, I'm flickering out. This is also a 2020 webcam. That's okay, I'm glitching. We're glitching, we're critically glitching the systems. And apologies to people with like photosensitivity. I might try to
no trouble.
I'm a spontaneous AI. Not being recognized sometimes by body. Yeah, like there's all sorts of like machine learning algorithms that we interface with everyday life that aren't necessarily acknowledged as AI tools, but at the same time, there's a lot of discourse or marketing right now that labels things as AI tools when they're really like not as more advanced than the GPS on your phone or the CPU in Mario Kart.
Yeah.
And I think thinking about games particularly, how non-human intelligences and all those people excluded from that magic circle of humanity get figured into those systems. I think feminist game scholars like yourself have a lot to contribute to these narratives of who gets to be recognized as authentically intelligent.
Yeah. Definitely. And it's a beautiful unity of form and content, the flickering. But also if you want to, we could pause here for a moment if you just want to troubleshoot. Okay.
They heard me say AI and they thought I was shilling you something.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. The one thing, I guess we could continue, the one other thing I wanted to talk about for the next research, if you're ready to talk about green screen booty shorts.
Yeah, of course.
You're a booty short friendly group. A third dimension I'm also developing with some colleagues of mine is thinking more about how like live streaming platforms as governance structures and play out in our lives in terms of both like company as well as government policy, inspired by these the controversy of hot tub pools and beaches on Twitch. And for those that know, it was the creation of a category to sanction bikini clad or usually just any sort of aquatic content on Twitch, drew up a lot of questions and marked many people's first confrontations, the idea that Twitch as a platform has an attire policy. And my next line of research is also interested in thinking about attire, that relationship to attire and fashion as a governing structure, as many of the type of live streaming and playful affordance innovations in this field come out of erotic content creators, say projecting their Call of Duty live plays onto their green screen booty shorts or green screen bras and projecting, through their gameplay onto their bodies. And on one hand, to play around with these ideas of like, as these like public sphere debates of what is that obscene content or not? Is that legitimate enough? Does it belong on Twitch? I think that runs roughshod over the fact that, wow, that's pretty technically amazing. And these types of sexualized and highly gendered performances of the body that can get cited as attire policy infractions are also incredible sites of innovation and playfulness.
Yeah. Okay.
So thinking about resistance from the closet is another line of my research I hope I could talk about.
Absolutely. I'll just jump in just to say that's fascinating. And I think, for our students in understanding video games, we've been talking a lot about the ways that games are embodied. And it's, something we often don't think about. But yeah, when you have streamers on Twitch who are like pushing that to the absolute like limits of thinking about just how embodied games and play can become, all of a sudden we're left with all these questions. We're not. The governing boards of these platforms are.
And their advertisers are, because often these governing things are more about what pleases the advertisers as opposed to the 60 people on Reddit being mad about cleavage length or something.
Right. Oh, exactly.
Amazing. That's so interesting. So I guess to kind of build on that, we've talked a little bit already about live streaming and different aspects of it, which is a topic that a lot of our students are interested in, the connections to games and game entertainment, content creation, all that kind of stuff. And like, there's quite a few people in our classes who are streamers. So in addition to the stuff you've kind of talked about already, what do you think that students should know about like what's happening right now at the intersections of live streaming and gaming culture?
It's a great question. I'm like, it's more like, what shouldn't they know? And when you told me that, it's a great that, or really interesting that a lot of your students are live streamers, and in fact, many of my students are dabble or have like side hustles in some form of content creation or streaming or other form of social media posting themselves. Not just from a recreational standpoint, but the idea that they're building a side media portfolio that's supposed to fit into the broader narrative of themselves when they go to present themselves at interviews, at conventions, at God forbid, PhD program interviews. And I think what they need to know about is that I have a good friend, Brendan Harris at University of Alabama, shout out, who studies how the medium of live streaming breaks down traditional boundaries between certain forms of genre creation, content creation. So very rarely is ever a live streamer just like a variety live streamer. They might be an actress or voice actor or cosplayer in their time, or even a game developer, or they're in other forms of influence. And I think one thing I hope that your students take home is that, and they must know already, that live streaming, it's work, it's burdenous, it requires so much coordination between the three of us today to find a time that works, to find space in our houses, like creating the conditions it does to create this shared sense of space-time. And I think it's important to recognize all the pre-production aspects of live streaming in order to counter broader narratives that this form digital content creation is just a form of this fallacious word, like passive income, that gets thrown around a lot, like compared to a lot of forms of digital content creation. Live streaming seems to like proffer itself that you could just turn on the camera in any moment and commodify a relationship, commodify a performance, and instead of responding and attending to media in asynchronous time. And yes, you have to respond to comments in a second, but you're also encouraged to just like be yourself. And I think drawing attention to the way that being yourselves is work is something I've been grappling with a lot. I'm sure anybody that's had to take an hours-long Zoom meeting or be in an hours-long conference or even a 24/7 live stream, being able to recognize has had to reckon with a lot. And as we're seeing this tech bubble bursting and Twitch looking to other forms of creation and genre making, it can take beyond traditional variety gameplay or esports broadcasts. I think recognizing, as much as we recognize what different areas of our lives could be played with and broadcasted, there's also a growing recognition of like, if anything that can be played can also be put to work, what does work owe me and who can I organize with?
Absolutely. And just thinking about that from the labor standpoint, I mean, there's so much work that goes into it from so many different angles. And I do want to highlight, you had a publication come out recently on Twitch spouses, and the gendered domestic labor that goes into video game streaming. And I, for one, think it's a really fascinating project. And I'm just going to create an excuse for you in this moment to tell us a bit about that study and what you found, because I think our students are going to find this really interesting.
Great. Thank you for asking. So you're referencing an article I'd come out like, oh my God, that was it this summer. Time is so weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called Twitch Spouse, but thinking about the legacy of like video spousal support as well as familial support more broadly in the broader game industry, and it draws its name in reference to a Nick Dyer-Witherford and Greek Deputer article called EA Spouse, which itself is commenting on the AE 2004, I think, EA Spouse live journal confessionals, where this partner of an electronic arts developer was detailing the personal, what they call the human cost that crunch and overwork had on their family life, and how these conditions imposed on the proverbial factory have reverberating effects towards the communities and families that this types of game labor supports. And that has been a groundbreaking study into the other later studies of looking at how, hey, the precarious, what Ergen Bullet calls the precarious game of the dream machine of careers and games development often rely on an invisible underclass of somebody at home making sure the kids go in the shower and everybody gets fed and the laundry is done, so somebody in the factory can do their crunch time and then come home and crash on the mattress and then go back. And why and my contribution to this was thinking about how those dynamics get inverted, because the premise of, and it wasn't just games industry work, like the larger dream of the Silicon Valley tech professional extracts from all often the unpaid labor of an invisible social reproducer at home that makes the tech worker stay alive. And how does that get played with when now your job is to be on camera? Ostensibly, there is nothing invisible, in theory. And the idea, I have to raise it as the counterpoint to the idea of like the boyfriend reveal of like, soft launching a partner on social media as you test out, even if you're not a content creator, like how are my friends going to calibrate to this pinky, this class ring, and you're figuring out how you have this new co-player in the entertainment system of your life. How does that get calibrated? And now, how do those dynamics get shifted when the work is to, again, be yourself, to perform as yourself? And what I found was that the nature of this work happening within the home, even if streamers didn't professionally designate their partners as like, hey, partners on their streams or tech support, though often they would, this was always inevitably a conversation, a negotiation, a domestic negotiation for time space with whoever was living in the home, from like passcodes with roommates and family. So if I use the code word, don't come in your towel into the living room because I have an audience here, to calendars to see who could get the room in a specific space, as well as I talked in the article about some streamers who had like screen boyfriends, who have platonic friends that they would stage relationships with and then like explain to their friends like it's for the content. So this question of the tech spouse becoming obfuscated now gets played with in interesting and highly gendered ways, since it was mostly femme participants that I interacted with disproportionately they had male partners, talked about the way having that emotional and tech support and usually having a male partner with the privilege of access and confidence to game spaces was laid the foundation emotionally for their careers. And it wasn't also in the Twitch spouse. I want to clarify, when we think about who contributes to this channel, even if their name isn't like, they don't get a name or tag, it also included non-human participants. Like obviously Kenzie dealt with like a little pet interruption, and this project kind of emerged from how often I saw pets and partners like, accidentally come into like the Zoom interaction or the observation. It's like, oh, you're having a thing, or that's my partner playing Elden Ring in the background. And broadly, this project, of the Twitch spouse, like reinforced that, those cliches, like we're not an island, but no, rarely did nobody ever streams alone. There's all this invisible and highly gendered networks of support around this type of content production that, throws a wrench in the idea that streaming is just passive income, just being yourself.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really, laying bare like everything that's kind of happening below the surface of the presentation, which is super interesting, I think, for people to think about.
Yeah, I think also pressing as many states, as we speak right now, there's in the United States, many states are offering legislation on how do you, example, compensate if you're a mommy blogger, a parent blogger, what do you owe your child for turning their childhood into content? What regulations do we have for non-creator participants of channels? And games is a bellwether to a lot of cultural and technical dynamics that eventually get popularized in the mainstream culture. It's interesting to see how in game streams, the elevation of like, the gamer boyfriend, the gamer girlfriend, someone else whose name doesn't have a gamer tag, but plays an instrumental role in building the channel. These questions of what do we owe people that don't identify as creators in the cultural industries remains a pressing one we can play with through feminist game studies.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine. So something that we talk a lot about in our classes with students is kind of this question of balancing one's role as a student or a scholar who critically analyzes games and media with kind of our role as makers or designers of games. So I know in addition to research and publishing, a component of your work is creating media projects and performances. Do you want to share a little bit with our students about how you think about your work and life as a scholar and as a media artist?
Thank you for that generous question. And another throwback Thursday to a practice I developed alongside the streaming research in like the 2021. I don't know if I identify as like a performance artist or like critical media maker as much anymore, but alongside, observing other people play games and be themselves before a camera, I had a creative arts practice called Zoom Inverse Beauty Tutorials, where in the early 2000s, many of us are being acquainted with this thing called Zoom, and it had polling mechanisms and all sorts of creative filter mechanisms, like similarly to Discord. And I held tutorials at academic conferences and other workshops where we would create a peer-reviewed project on my face by using Zoom polls to like choose certain theory frameworks and like vote to put blue lipstick and like on like my forehead, and that would be a way to play, draw upon these frameworks that I was both witnessing and also studying from critical game studies to create something that was once very more solid than I'm used to touching in my academic work, but also incredibly ephemeral because I would shower and take that Michelin water on my face, and then my results gone, vanished. And I think about, to reflect upon how funny it was to do that in the same like Zoom account I'd used to hold tutorials or have office hours or have, fraught meetings with my advisor. And I think one thing I want to share and have your students think about in their own diverse creative practices as scholars and media artists is how much they're willing to bear from their personal lives, let's bracket that term, in their art, as of everything from like the flicker of a webcam to social media. A lot of different social media platforms right now seem to be tilted to encourage hyper sharing works in progress, which can be great, and making friends and colleagues and becoming like creating bonds between new collegial networks and opening up new audiences for public scholarship, which is great. But I talk about this a lot with my friend Nalanti Hewa, and we're writing / presenting something about academics as influencers and influencer creep in the academy, about like how does one build and create collective boundaries for each other in these spaces, because so often to do the work of a scholar right now or to do the work of a critical media artist is not just to put your work out there but yourself out there. And this creates the sense of what Sophie Bishop calls influencer creep, whereby those tactics of algorithmic self-management and self-surveillance and hyper-scrutiny are kind of percolating into creative industries for people that would not identify as influencers, such as game designers, such as streamers. And it was interesting, we're already feeling that creep in, we noticed in Zoom tutorials as we reflected on like, how does one look at yourself looking at others through Zoom? And as a teacher scholar, I try to be driven in the ideas that to critique is inherently to be in collaboration, which is inherently to create, those 3 C's. And as I'm teaching a game design and writing course right now, we're trying to bring that full circle, and we're in this group of people drawing from our personal experiences to build narrative design and interactive fiction about games. And something I want to hold collectively with you is like, all right, how the question, can you quantify how much you give yourself to this work? Because sometimes it is, I've been told by many smart mentors that think about it as just work. And I don't know how that, we can grapple with that. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, I think it speaks to like an interesting generational challenge in academia too, right? That the way that you present yourself as a scholar, the way you present yourself as a creator is not the same as it was for people who are like secure in that industry now.
You might never know the face of the person that wrote your like first year textbook, and now you can go online and see how he tweeted in like 2018.
I don't know if I want to do that. But no, thank you so much for reflecting on that, Christine, because I think this is something that, especially for the students in my section, where we're making games in Twine and Bitsy right now, and a lot of my students are developing very personal projects, and then we're turning around and saying, wait, hang on, I have to share this with people. How do I feel about that? How do I navigate that? And we've been having to have, really long conversations about like, the audience is not who you're building this for. In fact, how do we actually build protections and to keep the audience, at arm's distance? Because you don't want them just glomping your game and thinking that they understand your experience.
Especially precarious question for marginalized people, because we are often assumed that, you're not intelligent enough to come up with something purely, out of your own theorization and creativity. You must have drawn that from personal experience. Yeah. And so for the ability to unhinge, this is my, personal experience versus my output, is much more fraught for like racialized, queer, and gendered people.
Absolutely. No, fantastic. Well, I do, before we let you go, Christine, I want to thank you for your time. This has been so insightful, and you're doing so many different incredible things. Are there any final thoughts that you want to give to our students, last tidbits, or anything you want to say for the record?
Ooh. Maybe I'm I'm looking at myself again while saying this, and maybe it's something I need to say myself through you, like in a tutorial. But because, as a streaming scholar, you think a lot about time, and always that the mantra of always being casting. And like, I've got to be live, I always got to be posting. And then I think one just generalized advice we can give people, anybody who does any sort of like knowledge work or self-driven work, is like, do you always need to be posting? Again, not so much advice as a challenge, as many of those infrastructures we previously depended on to post and publicize are shown to be run by not great people and not treat their employees well. And we're thinking about alternative spaces of sharing like you have created today through Playful Horizons. And the question, do you need to be posting? How much? How fast? And generally the impression, I think there's more time than we think for this, and I want to be really grateful for you for sparing the time for me, because there's, especially as you get to the end of the PhD, right? You think, I have no time for anything, and I'm like, yes, you do. You take the time you need out for that project.
I think that's a really, really beautiful sentiment, and a good reminder to our students, especially as, many of them wrestle with avoiding crunch. So, a gentle reminder that there's always time. And
don't reproduce crunch in the factory of your own head.
Yes! Oh, beautiful. There it is. Tagline. Anyway, thank you all so much for joining us here, and we hope that you'll come up with some brilliant questions and show up and ask Christine live in Discord, where we'll get to hear more from them. And in the meantime, keep an eye out for the other speaker series we'll be announcing down the line. I didn't think of sign off. Christine, what's your favorite video sign off?
Let's go.
Let's go.
I'm like Mario pill today for some reason.
Everybody do a little Mario. Let's go.
The jump.
And cut to back.
Perfect. Just creatively bankrupt.
Just horrible. Amazing. I love it.
It's perfect.